Hey guys, and welcome back to AP Psych. We're getting close to the end of our first unit on history approaches and research. And so this is the second half of our research. We did descriptive methods last time, and now we're getting into experimentation and how psychologists ask and answer questions. So make sure you grab your notes and let's get started. So, the backbone of experimentation is really exploring cause and effect. Like other sciences, experimentation forms the backbone of research in psychology. Examples of famous experiments that we'll talk about: Pavlov's dog, right? We'll get into that when we get into conditioning. Milgram's obedience study and how people respond to authority. Ash's conformity study and the effects of groupthink and conformity and the influence of others. We'll get into that when we get into social psych. But the big thing to remember here with research: experiments are the only form of research that isolates cause and effect, right? And that's the big thing. We talked about correlational studies, and they can show us the relationship between the variables and how they interact and how they're related. But experiments are the only thing that can tell us that A, or the independent variable, is causing B, or the dependent variable, and can show cause and effect. So that's what we're going to focus on here. We're going to talk about the parts of an experiment, which hopefully you guys are familiar with from science class and things like that you've learned. So we'll do an example here as we go, and we talk about the different parts of an experiment. This is going to be great for your vocabulary. If you haven't done these yet, you can use one example for the entirety of these vocab terms that deal with experimental research. So keep that in mind. Okay. So our first thing in a research experiment, you form your hypothesis. Right. We've talked about this before. It's a testable prediction. Okay. So it's an idea that we want to test out and see if we can understand what causes certain things, certain behaviors or mental processes. So for us, this is going to be the experiment that we've designed. Our question: does caffeine help keep high school teachers alert and happy? Okay. So we want to test the effect of caffeine on the behavior of high school teachers. So before we can do this, we need to create operational definitions of the various aspects of the experiment. So remember, we talked about this, touched on this a video or so ago. Operational definitions are extremely important so that research can be replicated and that the conditions are the same each time. So operational definitions for this situation: we would need to operationally define caffeine, what that looks like. Is it a caffeine pill? How many milligrams of caffeine? Is it just a cup of coffee? Is it 2 cups of coffee? We need to operationally define caffeine. And then we also need to operationally define alert and happy. How are we going to know what categorizes those behaviors and mental processes for these teachers? That could be something as easy as having teachers take a survey at the end of each day or something like that to measure their alertness and happiness and standardize those measures so that they can be operationally defined. Okay? That's an important part. So as we move on, we have to determine who our population is, which we've done. That's high school teachers, right? To be more specific, we're talking about Ralston Valley high school teachers here as our population. But for this experiment to work and to show cause and effect, we need a representative sample, a smaller group that gives a snapshot of the total population. So usually you're not going to be able to take everyone in your population and put them through an experiment. So that's why we need a representative sample. So for us at Ralston Valley, what's a representative sample? That could be making sure you have teachers from every department, male and female, different age groups, different education levels, things like that. Okay. So the question being, how do we obtain this representative sample? Okay. And just a reminder, representative sample is something that allows us to extrapolate our findings from our research to the larger population. Okay. So it's a very important thing. So to get our representative sample, we can do a couple things. You can do a random sample where everyone in the population has an equal chance of being selected. This is the separator. The representative sample and the random sample are the separators between experiments and quasi-experiments, because quasi-experiments cannot have these levels of sampling. So everyone in the population has an equal chance of being selected. So for example, we could put all of the teachers' names into a hat from Ralston Valley and draw out 50 names. Boom. We should now have a random representative sample of the entire teacher population. There's a second option, something called a stratified sample, where the population is divided into relevant subcategories, and a random sample is taken from each subcategory. So if we really wanted to be sure that we were representing all departments, all different subjects, male versus female, we could separate our teachers into those groups, and we could pull certain numbers randomly from those groups to ensure that we're getting a truly representative and random sample. Okay, so after we get our samples, we now have to assign our samples to the control versus experimental group. Okay? So the experimental group is the group that receives the special treatment, right? So in our experiment, we'll say it's group A. These are participants who are going to drink 2 cups of regular caffeinated coffee every morning for a month. Okay, so you can see we've operationally defined our caffeine, 2 cups of coffee every morning for a month. Okay. If you have in an experiment, you have your experimental group, but you need a control group, something you can compare your results to. Okay, so this is group B. Participants drink 2 cups of decaf coffee every morning for a month. Okay. Now, we'll get to this a little bit later, but neither group knows which group they're in. They both just assume that they're drinking regular caffeinated coffee. We don't tell them that it's decaf. That might skew our results. So participants drink 2 cups of decaf coffee every morning for a month. We now have our control group and our experimental group. Now, once a sample is obtained, researchers randomly assign participants to the experimental and control groups. Okay? So we did our representative sample, we did our random selection. Now we need something called random assignment. We need to randomly assign our teachers to either that experimental group or that control group. Okay? We do this because by random assignment, we're minimizing pre-existing differences between the two groups. And we make it even more generalizable or applicable to the entire population when our research is finished. So how do we randomly assign in our experiment? Well, after participants have gathered, we could just hand out numbered cards in no particular order to all to separate them into control and experimental groups. Right? Obviously, we don't tell them like, hey, here's the card for the control group, or here's the card for the experimental group. You might just say group A, group B, randomly given those cards to make sure that there's no bias in choosing who's in what group. Okay. Now, let's get into our variables a little bit in the experiment, talk about why these are important. The independent variable is also known as the cause. Okay? This is the factor that is manipulated by the experimenter that the effect is being studied. So in our experiment, the type of drink, caffeinated or decaf, is the independent variable. Okay? Now, the independent variable being the cause, the dependent variable is the effect that we're looking for. Right? The factor that may change in response to the independent variable. In psychology, this is an easy way if you get confused to differentiate between the independent variable and the dependent variable. In psychology, the dependent variable is usually a behavior or a mental process that we're looking for to see how it's impacted by our research, our medication, whatever we're doing, right? So in our experiment, that's the behavior, the alertness, the crankiness of the teachers. So how could we measure this? Well, we mentioned this a little bit ago, a couple slides ago. I said a survey, right? So we have to make our variables, we have to operationally define them so that they can be replicated, and we can use this again and show that it's truly cause and effect. So we could have teachers fill out a questionnaire at the beginning to get baseline data, and at the end of each day for the month, right? And that will give us a good measurable operationally defined dependent variable to show if, what the caffeine and what the decaffeinated coffee, what kind of effects they're having. Okay. So we've operationally defined both our independent variable as 2 cups of either caffeinated or decaffeinated coffee. And we've operationally defined our dependent variable by having teachers take questionnaires or surveys at the end of each day for the month. Okay. All right. So the placebo is an important part of many experimental research. And a placebo, maybe you've heard of it before. It's just a pseudo treatment or a fake treatment. So why do we have a placebo? Okay. To test the true effects of the independent variable, right? Sometimes the beliefs of participants can alter their behavior. Okay. So we want to make sure that we're controlling for that and making sure that no extra bias is creeping its way in. So what is the placebo in our experiment? It's the decaf coffee, right? The teachers in this group believe that they're getting caffeinated coffee, right? But they're not. So we're controlling for any effects of their beliefs that may alter their behavior, right? Because this could show us just the fact that them thinking they're getting caffeinated coffee, is that going to change the way, change their perceptions and make them think that they're happier or more alert? We need to control for that and make sure we understand if that's true or not. So that's the placebo in our experiment, the decaffeinated coffee. This happens a lot in medical research. So, for example, if you're testing out a new drug to see if it can help with Alzheimer's and memory as you age in Alzheimer's patients, a lot of times you'll have 2 groups. You'll have one group that receives the real medication and another group that receives most likely something like a sugar pill that doesn't have the medication in it. But it further shows the cause and effect, and we can truly isolate the impact of the independent variable. Is the medication really doing this, or is it just the belief that you're getting medication, right? And that's what a placebo helps us to differentiate in experimental research. So other things we can do to control for bias are 2 things called single blind and double blind studies. Okay. In a single blind study, participants do not know their assignment, right? So for us, in this experiment that we've put together, teachers do not know which group they are in, right? Okay. You have the control group who's getting the caffeinated coffee, and you have the experimental group who's getting you have the control group who's getting the decaf coffee, and you have the experimental group that's getting the caffeinated coffee. They don't know which group they're in. They both think they're just drinking coffee and seeing the effects. Okay. In double-blind research, the researcher nor the participants know their assignment. Okay. Teachers nor the person gathering data know which group is control or experimental group. So I want you to think about these 2 for a second. In terms of showing cause and effect and showing the true impact that the independent variable has upon the dependent variable, which of these would you consider to be better? Think about that for a second. Pause the video if you need to. Hopefully, you'd be coming to the conclusion that a double-blind study is the best possible, right? Because this removes all potential biases and expectations from both the researcher and the participant. And hopefully you're just truly getting the results and showing what the independent variable is doing in regards to the dependent variable. Okay, our last slide here, a couple things to note. There are such things as confounding variables that we try to control for as much as possible, but those are other items that could affect the outcome of the experiment other than the independent variable alone. So researchers need to do some brainstorming and try to account for as many confounding variables as possible in their experiment so they can control it as much as possible. So what could be some confounding variables in our experiment? Think that through for a second. What are some issues that could arise that could impact the dependent variable outside of what our goal is, the independent variable alone? So let's say there is still a little bit of caffeine in decaf coffee, right? So we have to understand that even though it's supposed to be caffeine free, there may be a little bit of caffeine still in there, and that could impact your results. What about the people who are in the experiment and their prior experience with coffee, right? Whether or not they're a regular coffee drinker. So, for example, I've never drank coffee before, right? And as a teacher in this experiment, it'd be a totally new experience for me. And that would definitely impact my results and my reporting on my survey and questionnaire at the end of each day. Also, the amount of sleep, right? That's a huge impact in alertness, happiness, overall attitude each day. So if you're not controlling for amount of sleep, that could be a huge confounding variable in this experiment. Okay, so these are things you got to think about as a researcher, especially when you're trying to isolate cause and effect, and how that can impact the results of your research. So that wraps up our experimental research example. Hopefully, this has been something you've recognized from different classes you've taken. If not, you can go back and review things if you need to. As always, ask me, send me an email if you need anything, and we'll talk about and go over some examples in class. Have a great day.